Hello my friends. If you've ever wanted to create your own scenery with a personal touch that won't break the bank and doesn't require the whole rigmarole of 3D printing, then I have the answer for you, and it is moulds.
Swamp Rip Miniatures.
Now I don't mean the kinds that you find in your mum's armpits, I mean these fun little flappy silicone ones that Green Stuff World had kindly sent me a while ago and which I've been having a ton of fun with ever since. I'm using these kind of sci-fi centric ones today to make a little photography background or display for some of my 40k miniatures, but you can get more fantasy oriented versions of these too if that's more your style. Just have a little look on their website. When you've decided on your molds and what kind of scenery or terrain you want to make, the next most important thing is deciding what material you'll use to actually cast your pieces. You have a few options here like your different putties and epoxy resins, but my preferred choice is this powdered acrylic resin stuff because it's cheap, it's non-toxic so you can whip it up inside without poisoning your whole family, and it cures really fast so you can literally have a whole scenery set up within an hour or two. This stuff's really easy to handle too. You just make a roughly 3 parts powder to 1 parts water mixture, give it a thorough stirring until there's no lumps left, and then pour it gently into your molds. It's good to have a little pokey stick on hand for this to work the mixture into all the little cracks and crevices, especially if they have some finer details on them, otherwise you can end up with some big old air bubbles that ruin your pieces. The working time for this stuff is around 10 to 15 minutes. After that it's starting to cure and gets a bit too difficult to pour and squish into the molds, so I definitely recommend doing multiple smaller pours if you're casting a lot of scenery, otherwise your mixture might go off in the pot before you can pour it. Also, try not to overfill your molds, otherwise the tops will be uneven and need sanding down if you want to lay them flat, but if you do, you can just skim off the tops with a nice little flat scraper to get rid of any lumps and kind of clean everything up to make popping them out of the molds a bit easier. As I said earlier, this stuff cures really quickly. It only takes about 30 minutes to harden up fully, but I like to leave mine for an hour or two just to be safe. And when you start popping out your pieces, it's quite likely you'll find some little imperfections here and there unless you are super diligent in your pouring phase. Luckily, they're really easy to clean up though. If you've got pieces with frass or extra bits from being overfilled or just spilling out, you can simply cut, carve or sand them away using your regular old hobby tools. And if you've got any gaps or air bubbles where the mixture hasn't quite made it into all the little nooks and crannies on the mold, you can just patch those up with a bit of green stuff or something similar. To be honest, I don't really bother with this as a lot of it won't be noticeable when you've got everything assembled and painted up, and any really bad bits can be covered up with other details. This is just for those of you who do want your scenery to be immaculate. The acrylic resin can be a little bit delicate on your thinner pieces, especially if you're as heavy-handed as I am. This isn't an issue if you're sticking it onto dioramas and stuff like that, but if you want to cast pieces for tabletop scatter or things that might get moved around and bashed up a lot, you might be better off casting something more durable like UV or epoxy resin, or you could line the backs with something like plasticard as reinforcement. But yeah, once you've got your pieces casted and cleaned up, you can just start gluing them together. I'm going for the most generic kind of sci-fi corridor thing possible because I want to use this as a background for when I take photos of my miniatures, but your imagination really is the only limit with this stuff. You can make whatever you want, and the box for the larger pieces did come with instructions of how to assemble them in different configurations for playable terrain, but I lost those just about as quickly as I opened the box, so yeah. Anyway, in what probably took a combined 2 to 3 hours maybe for casting, curing and assembly, and maybe cost a couple of quid for the amount of acrylic resin powder I've used, we've got ourselves a pretty nice looking little corridor here, but I want to make it just a touch more interesting, which is where the smaller detail molds come in. I've been using these in a bunch of my builds recently to add little screens and dials and other greebly bits, so you've probably seen them already, but I prefer to use UV resin for casting these as I find the powdered acrylic resin stuff is a bit messy when you're trying to glob it into much smaller holes, whereas the nozzle of the UV resin lets you inject it right up in there with no issue. I'm sure there's a penis joke in there somewhere. I still use a little piece of wire or something similar to make sure I'm poking the resin into all of those deepest recesses, as there will be air bubbles otherwise, and once I'm relatively happy with my pokery, I just use my UV torch to cure the resin, which only takes a couple of minutes per piece. If it's sunny where you live, you can fill a whole batch of moulds and then leave them outside for 10 to 15 minutes for them to cure all at once under the sun, but unfortunately I live in the UK and we're not allowed sun, so that's not an option for me. You can also buy a larger UV lights like the ones they use in nail shops, which would allow you to cure a big batch in one go as well, but for now I'm just piddling along with my little UV torch, doing a few at a time. You can use putties like green stuff on these smaller molds fairly reliably, but because it's much firmer than the liquid UV resin, you have to really push it into the molds quite firmly to make sure you're picking up all the details, and since the molds are flexible, this can make the edges of your piece a bit wonky looking. The green stuff pieces I've made here look pretty good to be honest, but it was definitely more of a fiddly, time intensive process than the UV resin. Green Stuff World have these tiny little rivet molds as well, and if you're using these, I'd avoid trying to inject the resin directly from the nozzle, as you'll end up with huge air bubbles that ruin the rivets, and it'll just generally be a messy and annoying process. Instead, I like to just kind of gloop a bit of resin onto some wire and then use that to fill the molds instead. I found this was a lot easier and gave me much more consistent results with no major air bubbles. Some of these other molds are quite deep, and if you want to fill them fully, it's best to do multiple layers of UV resin, curing them each time before adding the next. If you just glooped it all in one go, then try to cure it, your UV light might not penetrate the piece fully, and you'll be left with horrible, sticky, uncured and unusable pieces. If you want to get the cool surface details of the piece without having to waste excess resin or having a huge bulky piece that sticks out too much, just do one thin layer of resin and then cure it. You'll lose some details around the edges, and it's good to do this on a flat surface so you don't end up with big old slanted edges like I've got here. Either way, you might have to do a little bit of cleanup, but if you want skinny pieces, that's the price you pay. Like I said though, after a few minutes of UV light exposure, these babies will be done and you can start popping them like weasels. Just like the larger molded pieces, you may have some slight defects from air bubbles or overpours, so again, you can just clean up those with a bit of green stuff or sanding if you so desire, but if you're lazy like me, you can just find a way to position these pieces so the flaws aren't so obvious. And then yeah, you're good to go again. Just start gluing these bad boys down to your scenery or your miniatures and whatever else, and you've got yourself some fancy little pieces which took almost no time at all to make. I think these kind of details add a lot to miniature dioramas and scenery, so it's always worth keeping these molds and a bottle of UV resin to hand. I assembled my pieces on a slightly wonky piece of polystyrene, so I did a bit of filling on some of the worst gaps and then used a few tubes and wires to add some extra detail and hide any of the pieces with damage or noticeable air bubbles on. And there we have it, my friends, maybe the quickest and easiest way of creating your own scenery at home, and if you're looking for some paints to make it look all nice and fancy, then definitely check out Green Stuff World. They'd sent me a bunch of their new coloured metallic paint range, which I was really excited to try out, and I especially like how the metallic red looked on this corridor against all the other dirty colours. I'm pretty awful at stuff like non-metallic metals, so it's awesome to have metallic paints that aren't just the regular gold, silver and coppery colours, and I'm looking forward to testing these out further on some miniatures. I reckon we can get some really flash looking space marine armour with these, but that's a story for another day. For now, I'll finish by saying I highly recommend these molds if you're interested in making scenery without all the added faff and expense of stuff like 3D printing. Obviously you're more constrained because you can only cast what's on the actual molds themselves, but there's a good range of these already at Green Stuff World, and I'm sure more to come if people are interested in them. You'll no doubt be seeing more of these molded pieces in my future builds, so leave a comment when you see them, and whoever spots the most will win at least half of whatever I had for lunch that day. And if you enjoyed this video, then do all the usual likes and subscribes and comments and yada yada yada. But for now, as always, I have been your friendly neighborhood swamp rat, and I will see you very soon in another video. See ya!